They kept the townhouse on King Street. They kept both boats. They kept $6.8 million in 12 accounts. They gave him a deaf 11-year-old Bullmastiff that weighed 137 pounds and a storage bill for $1,847. The stepmother signed the dog over in writing in front of 2 witnesses because she wanted him out of her house before the reception. She had 91 pages of her husband's trust in her lap that morning, and she had read 4 of them. 9 days later, a woman nobody in that family would name stood up in a Charleston courtroom and read the 5th page out loud. But go back. Go back to a Wednesday in March, to a funeral home on Broad Street with a brick face and black shutters and a magnolia out front that had been dropping leaves on the same sidewalk since before anybody in this story was born. Go back 40 minutes before the service. Emory Slate parked his truck at the end of the block because the spaces closer and were being held by a man in a green vest for cars that cost more than the truck did. He shut the door and stood on the sidewalk for a second with his hand still on the frame, the way a man does when he isn't sure the building will let him in. He was 44, 6'1", and he'd been 6'1.5" before the spine, and he'd stopped correcting people about the half. Dark hair with the gray coming in hard at the temples, cut close the way he'd worn it for 22 years because he'd never found a reason to wear it any other way. Gray eyes, sun-lined at the corners, a face that had been outdoors more than indoors. He had a navy dress uniform and a garment bag in the closet of a rented house in North Charleston, and he no longer had the right shoulder to wear it. 3 surgeries, 2 plates, and a fusion at L4. L5 had left him with a back that could not tolerate the weight of that jacket for 90 minutes of standing. So he wore a black suit. It fit him everywhere but the back. Across the shoulders it pulled, and at the base of the spine it hung wrong, and there wasn't a tailor in the state who could fix what was under it. The lobby smelled like lilies and lemon polish. There was a card on a brass easel by the chapel doors with his father's name on it in a script font. Wendell August Slate, 1948 to 2026, and a young funeral director in a navy suit standing beside it with a clipboard held against his chest like a shield. "Sir, are you family?" "I'm his son." The director looked down at the clipboard. He looked at it longer than a man looks at a short list. Then he did the thing that people do when they've been given an instruction they don't personally agree with and have decided to follow anyway. "The front 2 pews are reserved for immediate family," he said. "I have Mrs. Slate and Mr. Slate III and 4 others. I'm sorry, I don't have a card with your name on it." "That's all right," Emory said. It wasn't a fight. He'd been in real ones. You learn the difference. He walked back out to the truck to check on the dog, because the dog was the reason he'd come 40 minutes early in the first place. Deuce was in the back seat with the windows cracked and a folded moving blanket under him because his hips didn't like the vinyl anymore. 11 years old, 137 pounds on the vet scale in January, down from 144. Brindle, dark as a wet dock piling across the shoulders, gone white at the muzzle and around the eyes so that he looked like an old man wearing a mask of himself. A head the size of a cinder block, ears that had heard nothing at all for the last 3 years. Stone deaf. The vet had called it geriatric onset and said there was nothing to do about it. And Wendell Slate had said fine and taught the dog 14 hand signals over the following winter, one at a time, sitting on the floor of a King Street kitchen at 77 years old with a bag of dried liver in his lap. Flat palm down was stay. 2 fingers to the hip was heel. A closed fist raised to the chest was come. And when the dog was asleep and you needed him, you didn't shout because shouting was nothing to him now. You put your boot heel down on the floorboards twice hard and let the vibration walk up through the wood into his ribs, and he'd lift that big white face and find you. Emory opened the door and put a flat palm on the dog's chest and held it there. Deuce leaned into it. That was the whole conversation. The widow had not let the dog into the house since the night Wendell died. Not the kitchen, not the mudroom, not the back garden with the brick wall. Emory had picked him up from a boarding kennel on Rutledge with 11 days' fees due, paid in cash, and the dog had come out with a raw patch on his elbow and had not eaten a full meal since. Inside, the chapel filled. Shipping men, port men, 2 harbor pilots, a Coast Guard captain retired, half the vestry from St. Philip's. Wendell Slate had run coastal freight for 39 years and had shaken every hand on that peninsula at least twice. Camille Slate held the front pew like a woman holding a table she'd reserved. 52. Small, 5'2" in heels she never took off, and immaculate in a pearl gray Chanel suit with a black silk shell under it and a single strand at her throat. Ash blonde hair, set that morning. A face kept very still, the stillness that money buys and then maintains on a schedule, so that nothing on it moved except when she chose to move it. Beside her sat her son, Trip, 29, in a suit that fit him beautifully and hands that had never done anything, sunglasses still on indoors, thumb working the face of phone he held down between his knees like the angle made it invisible. Camille turned when Emory came up the side aisle. She rose maybe 4 inches out of the pew and took his forearm with both hands, and to every one of the 200 people watching it looked like grief being shared. Her mouth came close to his ear. "Your father made his feelings clear at the end," she said. "I don't want any confusion today." "All right. The reading is Thursday. Bertram's office on Broad. You don't need to attend." A small squeeze of his arm, warm as a handshake. "There's nothing in it for you, Emory. I'd hate for you to drive in for that." She sat back down and smoothed her skirt and face front, and that was the last thing she said to him inside that building. He took a seat 11 rows back, on the aisle, next to a woman he didn't know. He lasted 9 minutes. Through the chapel wall, he could hear it, not hear, feel, the truck out on Broad Street, rocking on its springs. 137 pounds of frightened old dog standing up and turning around and standing up again in a back seat, and then the low, broken sound bullmastiffs make when they are past barking and into something worse. 2 people in the back row turned to look toward the doors. So Emory went out and got him. He clipped on the lead and brought the dog up the steps, and the young funeral director opened his mouth and then looked at the size of the animal and did not say the sentence he'd been planning. They came in through the back of the chapel during the second hymn. And here is the thing that 200 people in Charleston talked about for the rest of that year. Deuce did not look at the casket. He did not look at the flowers. He went up the center aisle and an old dog's walk, nails clicking on the heart pine, his head level and low, and he passed the front pew, past Camille Slate close enough that her skirt moved, without lifting his head 1 inch. He did not smell her. He did not smell Trip. He went by them like they were furniture. Then he turned around. 40 feet back down the aisle he went, all the way to the rear of the chapel, past every row, and he stopped in front of a gray-haired woman standing alone against the back wall where the ushers stand. He lowered himself down, hips first, the way old dogs do, in 2 parts, and he lay across her feet. She was 57, tall, near enough 5'10", in a plain navy dress that had been pressed and put away and pressed again, flat shoes, no jewelry, gray hair pulled back off her face, hands that had worked outdoors and in cold water for a long time, wide across the knuckles, one thumbnail short and ridged, a canvas satchel over her shoulder with a worn leather buckle, and a face. That was the part. That was the part half the room caught and then made themselves uncatch. She had Wendell Slate's face, the long jaw, the deep-set eyes, the same heavy brow that came down over them like a shelf. She had it so completely that a man in the 4th row said Lord out loud, without meaning to. She looked down at the dog on her feet. She didn't reach for him. She put one hand flat on the wall behind her like she needed it. Up front, Camille Slate stood. The color went out of her face in a single pass, top to bottom, and for the first time all morning something moved on it that she had not chosen. She said one word. Out. The organist kept playing. That's the strange part. The organist kept playing right through it, and the minister looked at his notes, and 200 people looked at their hands, and Emory Slate walked 40 feet down that aisle and knelt by his father's dog with his rebuilt back screaming at him, and put a flat palm on the dog's chest and did not move him. They stayed at the back through the eulogy. The dog never got up. Afterward, there was a receiving line in the lobby, because there's always a receiving line, and Camille stood at the front of it with her hand out and her face reassembled. Emory stood at the far end, where nobody had put him, and the gray-haired woman came through the crowd toward him with the satchel against her hip. She didn't introduce herself. She took his right hand in both of hers the way you take a rope somebody through you. She pressed 2 things into his palm and closed his fingers over them. He said you'd be the one who came, she said. Don't let her have the dog. And she was out the door on a broad street before he'd gotten a single word past his teeth, gone left toward meeting gone. He opened his hand in the parking lot with the sun coming off the truck hood. A brass key, small, flat, worn bright at the shoulder, with a stamped oval tag on the ring, 14, and his father's pocket watch. The old shipping line watch, the one Wendell had carried since 1974, nickel case on the color of dishwater, the crest of the line half rubbed off the lid. Emory had watched that watch come out of that man's pocket 10,000 times. The case back was loose. He turned it with his thumbnail, and it came off in his hand, and folded into the well behind the movement was a strip of paper about the width of a matchstick, cut clean with a straight edge. 9 digits, written in his father's cramped block hand, and under them 3 letters. PWV. He stood in a funeral home parking lot on Broad Street, holding a key, a watch, and 9 digits, with a deaf dog watching him through the truck window, and he had no idea what any of it was. The reception was at the house on King Street. He went because his father's friends asked him to, and because he had a plate of somebody's ham biscuits pushed into his hand in the front hall by a woman who'd known his mother. The house was full. Camille moved through it like a hostess at a benefit, and Tripp stood by the bar in the dining room with his sunglasses finally off, telling 2 men about a boat. At 2:20, she found Emory in the hall by the stairs, and she was not alone. She had a man in a gray suit with a folder, Bertram Cleave's associate, and a woman with a stamp and a logbook, and 2 of Camille's friends from the Garden Society standing by like they'd been asked to hold the door. "Before you go," Camille said. She took a single page out of the folder. "This is just housekeeping." It was 1 page. Transfer of ownership, and beneath it a paragraph identifying the animal known as Deuce, male, brindle, canine, 11 years of age, microchip on file, and transferring all right, title, and interest in said animal from Camille Slate, surviving spouse of Wendell A. Slate, to Emory Slate, absolutely and without condition or reservation. "I'm not keeping him," she said. "I'm allergic, and he's destroyed the runner in the back hall, and frankly, he's a liability at his size. Sign it, and he's yours. Free and clear. Nobody can ever come back on you about it." Emory read it twice. It said what it said. He signed it against the Newell Post. The 2 Garden Society women signed as witnesses under his name. The notary stamped it, wrote it into her book, and dated it, and she'd been paid in advance. Emory found out later, $90, arranged 4 days earlier, before the flowers were even ordered. Camille took the executed original, slid it into the folder, and handed him a second piece of paper. An invoice. Meeting Street Self-Storage. Unit 14. Past due, 11 months, $1,847. "That was his," she said. "I'm not paying for it. He never told me what's in it, and I don't care." Then she said the sentence, out loud, in her own kitchen hallway, in front of 6 people, in her own words, in the voice she used for waiters. "Take the dog, take the bill, and don't come back to this house." Emory Slate folded the invoice into his inside pocket, next to a brass key, stamped 14, and a watch with 9 digits hidden under the case back, and walked out the front door of the house he grew up in and down the steps to the truck, where 137 pounds of deaf old Bullmastiff lifted his head at the vibration of a boot heel on the sidewalk. He had no idea he had just been handed everything. Neither did she. 8 years is a long time to lose a father who is still alive. It started with a jump he'd made 400 times before. Night insert, Gulf of Aden, a rig that came up under him wrong, and a wave that came up under the rig. Emory Slate walked away from it, which is what he told people. And what he told people was technically true. He walked away from it for 11 months. Then the L4 and L5 that had been quietly grinding themselves in a gravel finished the job, and a Navy neurosurgeon in Portsmouth put 2 titanium cages and 6 screws into the base of his spine and told him, kindly, in the flat voice they use, that he was done. Medical retirement. 40%. A folder, a handshake, a flag he didn't want, and a body that woke him up at 3 every morning like a phone ringing in another room. The first year, he could not lift his own kit bag. That is the detail he never said out loud to anyone, not once in 8 years. 62 pounds of gear he had carried through 3 deployments and 2 continents, and it sat on the floor of a rented apartment in Norfolk for 4 months because he could not bend and take the weight without going gray at the edges of his vision. He'd stand over it. He'd put a hand on the strap. He'd let go. He called his father every Sunday that year. For a while, Wendell answered. He'd ask about the physical therapy in that clipped, unsentimental way he had, like he was asking about a container schedule out of Savannah. He'd say things like bone knits, and you'll get it back. And once at the end of a call, he'd said your mother would have moved up there and made you crazy, and they'd both laughed, and neither of them had said her name again. Then Camille started answering. It wasn't sudden. That's the part people get wrong about how families end. It's not a slammed door. It's a slow substitution. He's resting, Emory. He's out on the boat. He's at the doctor. He's not up for it today. Always pleasant. Always the same warmth you'd give a man selling something at the door. Every message taken. None of them delivered. He drove down twice. The first time, in year 3, he got as far as the front steps on King Street, and Camille met him in the doorway with her hand on the frame and told him his father was sleeping and it wasn't a good week and she'd have him call. The second time, in year 5, he sat in the truck across the street for 40 minutes and watched the front room light go on and off. And then he drove back to Norfolk without knocking and hated himself for it for 3 years. There were letters. He knows now there were letters. He didn't know it then. The last time Emory Slate heard his father's voice was a Tuesday in February at 6:41 in the evening from a number he didn't recognize because it wasn't the house line and it wasn't the cell. It was the landline in the office at the old warehouse on Concord. The one Coastal had shut down in 2011 and Wendell had never given up the number on. 16 seconds. Emory has never deleted it. He has played it, by his own count, more than 400 times. There's a breath at the start of it. Then the voice, thinner than he remembered, sanded down by whatever the morphine and the tumor had been doing to it, but still his. Emory, it's your dad. A pause. 3 seconds of a man deciding how much he can say on a machine in a house that isn't his anymore. Listen to me. The dog knows where I put it. That's all. The dog knows where I put it. And then the click. He called back 19 times over the next 4 days. The warehouse line rang into nothing. The house line went to Camille. 11 days later, Wendell Slate died at 4:20 in the morning in a hospital bed set up in his own front parlor. And Emory found out about it from a funeral home in an email addressed to the family of. He had spent 9 weeks thinking his father had lost the thread at the end. But the message was fog. That was a dying man talking about a dog. He was wrong about that. And he was about to find out how wrong. Meeting Street Self-Storage sits behind a chain-link gate 2 blocks up from the crosstown, a low run of orange roll doors baking in the September heat, gulls on the fence line. The woman behind the counter was maybe 23 and had a box fan pointed at her face. Emory put the invoice on the counter and counted out $1,847 in cash, hundreds and twenties, most of what was in his account after the drive down. She looked at the number. She looked at him. You want a receipt? I want 3. He took the copies, folded them, and put them in his inside pocket next to the watch. Unit 14 had 2 locks on it. His father's brass padlock, which the key fit, and the facility's red overlock, which they cut for him with a battery grinder, and the sparks came off it in a bright rope, and Deuce didn't so much as blink because Deuce hadn't heard anything in 3 years. The door went up on its rollers, and 11 months of shut air came out at them. He'd expected furniture, boxes of it, the deadweight junk a man accumulates and a widow purges. It was not furniture. It was a life packed by somebody who knew exactly what he was doing. His mother's sewing table was 3 feet inside the door, the oak one with the drop leaf and the burn ring from a curling iron in 1989, wrapped in moving blankets and taped at the corners. Behind it, on steel shelving, Wendell had clearly bolted together himself. 40 years of coastal shipping ledgers stood spine out in date order. 1979 through 2009, green cloth boards, every one of them labeled in his father's block capitals. A wooden crate of navigation charts. A folded flag in a triangle case. A coffee can of brass door keys to buildings that didn't exist anymore. And against the right wall, taking up 9 feet of the unit, something long and low under a fitted canvas cover, tied down at 4 points with sash cord, the cover pale gray and clean and obviously made for whatever was under it. Emory stood and looked at that cover for a good 10 seconds. He put his hand on the front corner of it. He did not lift it. He didn't lift it because Deuce had walked past him. The dog went by his leg without stopping, past the sewing table, past the ledgers, past the thing under the canvas, 137 pounds of old brindle mastiff moving down that concrete floor with the unhurried certainty of an animal walking into a room he has been in 1,000 times. 40 feet to the back wall. Same walk he'd done up the center aisle of a chapel on Broad Street 3 days before. At the back, half buried under a stack of empty crates, was a footlocker. Olive drab, stenciled, hasp-rusted, the kind of box the Navy issued in 1968 and Wendell Slate had carried home from Subic Bay. Deuce shoved 2 of the crates off it with his shoulder. He climbed on top of it. He turned around once, lowered himself down across the lid with a grunt that came up out of the floor, and put his chin on his paws. Emory said his name, which was pointless. He clapped, which was worse than pointless. He walked back and gave a hand signal for off, 2 fingers down, palm flat, right in front of the dog's face, and Deuce looked at it and looked at him and did not move. "Okay," Emory said, out loud, to a deaf dog in a storage unit. "Okay." It took him 4 minutes and both hands under the dog's chest to get him to shift, and Deuce only went 18 inches, and he sat there the whole time watching the lid like it might leave. The hasp was rusted through. Emory pulled it with a screwdriver. Inside, the first thing was envelopes. Hundreds of them, banded in bundles of maybe 20 with rubber bands gone to tar, and every single one addressed in his father's block capitals to a name Emory had never heard in his life. Ruth Vann, General Delivery, McClellanville, South Carolina. Some of the bundles were 30 years old. The stamps went from 25 cents to first class forever. Some were marked Return to Sender in a post office stamp. But most of them, and this is the part that made Emory sit back on his heels on that concrete floor, most of them had never been mailed at all, and every one of them, mailed or not, had been opened. Opened and resealed. Not by the sender. Slit clean across the top with a letter opener by somebody with a steady hand, then taped shut again with a strip of clear tape laid down neat and square. 30 years of a man writing to somebody, and 30 years of somebody else reading it first and deciding it wasn't going anywhere. Under the envelopes was a manila folder, and in the folder was a certified copy of a birth certificate. State of South Carolina, Charleston County. Female, born March 11th, 1969. Mother, Delia Vann. Father, in the space where a lot of certificates from 1969 say nothing at all, Wendell Slate. And under it, in ink gone brown, the same signature that was on 11 years of Emory's report cards. Ruth Vann was 57 years old. Emory Slate was 44. His father had signed that certificate 5 years before Emory was born. The last thing in the footlocker was a photograph, and it was the one that took the legs out from under him. Black and white, deckled edge, a shrimp dock at low tide, boom rigging, and a stack of wire baskets. A young Wendell Slate, 26, maybe hair still black, sleeves rolled, a face Emory had only ever seen in his mother's wedding album, holding a girl of about 6 on his hip. She had one arm around his neck and a fistful of his collar. She was laughing at whoever held the camera. She had his jaw. She had the jaw Emory had watched walk into the back of a chapel and stand alone. On the back, in pencil, in the same block capitals, R. Bulls Bay 75. McClellanville is 40 miles up Highway 17 and about 60 years back. Live oaks over the road, Spanish moss hanging dead still in the heat, a creek and a fleet and a single main street. Emory found the oyster house at the end of Pinckney, tin roof, cinder block, a hand-lettered board out front and a stack of pallets by the door, and a woman out back running a hose over a steel table. Ruth Vann was 57 and tall, 5'9", maybe 5'10", built like somebody who has moved weight for a living every day of her adult life. Gray hair, cut short, and pushed back off her forehead with the back of a wet wrist. Rubber boots, a canvas apron over a faded work shirt, forearms like cable, hands swollen at the knuckles from 40 years of cold water and oyster shell. And that face, Wendell Slate's face, softened at the mouth and nowhere else. She shut off the hose when the truck door closed. She looked at Emory. Then she looked past him at the dog getting down out of the truck bed, and something in her held very still. "He came with you," she said. "He came with me." She wiped her hands on the apron. "You want to say something? Say it standing. I've got a load coming at 4. I found your letters." "They're not mine," Ruth said. "They never got to me. That makes them his." Emory took out the photograph and held it up. She looked at it for a long moment and didn't take it. "Bulls Bay," she said. "He come up Saturdays. Told my mother he was checking on a boat." She turned back to the table and picked up a knife and set it down again. "I'm going to say this once so we don't have to circle it. I'm not here for money. I never asked that man for $1. And when he offered more than once, I said no, and I meant it. I've run this house 19 years. It's mine. Ich liebe Fine." "Then why'd you come to the funeral?" "Because somebody in that room had to actually be sorry." Emory took out the pocket watch, opened the case back, and unfolded the strip of paper with the 9 digits and the 3 letters on it. Ruth looked at it and her jaw moved once. "PWV," she said. "Palmetto Wharf Vault. East Bay. It's a box." She met his eyes. "He put my name on it in 2019. Mine and his, together, both signatures, and he made me drive down and sign the car myself in front of a bank officer, and he wouldn't tell me why. I've never opened it. Never had the second thing you need." "What's the second thing?" "The key," Ruth said. "Stamped 14. The vault room at Palmetto Wharf is 8 feet by 10 with a steel table bolted to the floor." The officer walked out. The door closed. Ruth put the long box on the table, and Emory lifted the lid. There was no jewelry, no cash, no thief. There was a document bound in a black spring channel, 91 pages thick, with a blue back cover sheet and a raised notarial seal, and a date on the first line that changed everything. Irrevocable trust agreement of Wendell Slate. Executed this 14th day of March, 2019. 2 years before the will Bertram Cleves had locked in a drawer on Broad Street. 2 years before the morphine. Irrevocable. Not a will. Not something a widow's attorney can contest into a settlement. A trust a man builds while he is well, funds while he is well, and cannot take back afterward even if he wants to, and Wendell Slate, whatever else he was, had not wanted to. Article 4 listed the corpus. Emory read it twice, and his hands did not shake until the second time. $6.8 million in accounts and securities transferred into the trust in 2019 and 2020. The King Street townhouse. The 2 boats, all titled chattels of the settler, wherever situated, including specifically the contents of the leased premises at Meeting Street Self-Storage, Unit 14. Page 5 was the funding condition. 1 paragraph. 61 words. The corpus shall vest in and be distributed to the person who has care, custody, and control of the dog Deuce, male Bullmastiff. Microchip number is annexed. On the date of my death and thereafter, and such person shall be the sole beneficiary of Article 4, without regard to any instrument, testamentary or otherwise, executed by me at any later date. Ruth read it over his shoulder and made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "He didn't leave it to a person," she said. "He left it to whoever loved him enough to take the dog." And then the second paragraph at the bottom of page 5, and this one had both their names in it, typed out in full, no initials, no issue of my body, no lawyer's hedging. "The residuary of my estate shall be divided in 2 equal shares, 1 to Emory Slate, 1 to Ruth Vann." Ruth Vann put both hands flat on that steel table and stood there and didn't say a word for a long time. She had 91 pages, and she read 4. Let that sit for a second. Camille Slate had a lawyer, a notary on retainer, 2 witnesses from her garden society, and 11 weeks alone with a dying man. And she never once asked what was in Unit 14, because it looked like junk, and she gave away 137 pounds of deaf old dog in writing, because he shed on her hall runner. If you've ever watched somebody get handed the thing they didn't want and walk away with everything, hit subscribe before the hearing starts, because this next part, the part at the dining table on King Street, with her own signature sitting in a folder 18 inches from her hand, is the part she never saw coming. Now, the dining room. 9 days after the funeral, on a Monday at 2 in the afternoon, Emory Slate and Ruth Vann walked up the steps of a house on King Street that Emory had been told not to come back to, and a housekeeper opened the door because Camille had been expecting only one of them. The dining room on King Street seats 12. That afternoon it held 6. Camille sat at the head of the table in cream linen with her hands folded, the way people sit when they have already decided how a conversation ends. Tripp sat to her right with his phone face down on the mahogany and his sunglasses hooked in his collar, indoors again. And between them, in a chair pulled out an inch too far, sat Bertram Cleves, 68, heavy through the middle, a seersucker jacket, half glasses on a cord, the kind of family lawyer who has been to more of a family's weddings than its depositions and has never once had to be right about anything. Emory took the chair at the far end. Ruth sat down beside him and set her canvas satchel on the floor by her boot. Camille looked at Ruth for exactly 1 second and then decided, visibly, not to look at her again. "Mr. Cleves has drawn up something," she said. "I want this finished before it becomes unpleasant." Cleves slid a single page down the table. Emory didn't touch it. $40,000, Cleves said, in exchange for a full release of any claim against the estate of Wendell Slate. "It's generous. It's more than the will provides, which is nothing." "That's fine," Emory said. Camille's chin came up half an inch. She thought she'd won. And this is the part one want you to listen to, because nobody wrote it for her. Nobody put words in her mouth. There was a court reporter in the room. Emory had hired one for $220, and she had been sitting quietly against the wall since 2 o'clock, and Camille had assumed she was somebody's assistant. "I don't want you to think this is cruelty," Camille said. "Your father was not a sentimental man at the end. He was in pain, and he was clear. Bertram drew the will in October of 2021, and Wendell signed it. He was on morphine in October of 2021, Emory said. He was comfortable, she said. He was on a 25 microgram patch and 2 milligrams of liquid morphine every 4 hours, Ruth said, without raising her voice. The hospice charts in the county file. I pulled a Friday. Camille's hands came apart on the table. He knew what he was signing, she said. I sat with him. I sat with him for 11 weeks while you were where? Exactly? I moved the accounts because somebody had to move them. Do you understand what happens to a shipping company when the man who runs it stops answering mail? I consolidated. I did the work. Every dollar in those accounts moved because I picked up a phone and made it move, and I'm not going to apologize for having been the only adult in that house. You moved them the last 11 weeks of his life, Emory said. I moved them when it became necessary. Into accounts with your name on them. Into accounts that functioned, Camille said, and she said it hard, and she said it in front of a court reporter and a licensed attorney and a woman with her husband's exact jawline, sitting 15 feet away. Cleves put a hand flat on the table. Camille, she wasn't finished. That's the thing about people who have never been contradicted. When it finally happens, they don't get quieter, they get louder, because volume has always worked before. And as for her, Camille said, and now she did look at Ruth, one flick of the eyes and away, that woman is a bookkeeping error. That is all she has ever been. There were payments going out of a private account for 30 years, and I found them in 2014, and Wendell told me it was handled. It was money to keep a mistake quiet. That's what it was. That's what she is. A line item my husband paid every March so it would stay out of his house. Ruth Vann did not move. 57 years old, hands like a woman who has shucked oysters for 19 winters, and she sat there and let it land and didn't blink. He paid it every March, Ruth said, because that's when the oyster season closes and the money runs out. He knew that because he asked. That's not hush money. That's a father. He never claimed you. He signed my birth certificate, Ruth said. In 1968. His hand, his name, the line that says father. It's in a footlocker in a storage unit you never bothered to open. And Tripp, 29 years old, soft-handed, who had not said one word in 11 minutes, chose that moment to panic out loud. Mom, the boats, he said. Tripp, they're listed. They've been listed since the 9th. Both of them. There's a buyer coming Thursday for the 42. He looked down the table at Emory with a kind of wet, offended confusion. You can't. Those are already under contract. You can't unwind that. Nobody said anything for about 4 seconds. Emory reached into his jacket and put a folder on the table and slid it the length of the mahogany, and it stopped in front of Camille, and he did not open it for her. March 2019, he said. Irrevocable. 91 pages. Page 5 has one condition on it. Camille opened the folder the way you'd open a bill you already know the amount of. She read for maybe 40 seconds. Her face didn't change because her face hadn't changed in a decade. But her thumb did. Her thumb pressed down on the corner of page 5 until the paper bent. "This is nothing," she said. "This is a draft. There's no dog. This says the dog. It says whoever has care, custody, and control of the dog," Emory said, "on the date of his death and thereafter." Cleves took his glasses off. He read page 5 twice. Then he read the signature page, and then the notary block, and then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of a dining room he had eaten Thanksgiving dinner in, and he said very quietly, "Camille, where is the animal?" She said, "I had him removed." "Where is the animal, Camille?" "I had him removed in writing," she said. "There's a transfer. There's a notarized transfer. He signed it. I made him sign it in front of witnesses so he could never come back and say I stole a dog." And Ruth Vann laughed, one syllable out loud in that dining room. "Ma'am," she said, "you notarized it yourself." 48 hours before the hearing, at 9:20 on a Tuesday night, Trip Slate made the only decision in this entire story that was worse than his mother's. Emory was at Unit 14 with a rolling door up and a shop light clipped to the frame, boxing 30 years of shipping ledgers for the trust accountant. Deuce was lying on the concrete just inside the door where the air moved, on his side, all 137 pounds of him, brindle gone white to the eyes, asleep the way deaf dogs sleep, completely without one ear turning. A pickup came down the row and stopped at an angle across the door. Trip got out with a folded paper in his hand, and a second man got out of the passenger side, a hired handler, 6'3", 240, work gloves, a catch pole in his right hand, and a slip lead over his shoulder. "That dog's estate property," Tripp said. "The transfer's void. Coercion. My lawyer says it's void." "Your lawyer withdrew," Emory said. "My other lawyer." The handler didn't say anything. He just started walking, and this is the part one need you to see clearly, because the dog had been deaf for 3 years and had not heard a truck, a door, a voice, or his own name since 2022. But concrete carries. A 240-pound man in work boots puts a wave through a poured slab that a dog can feel in his chest from 20 feet away, and Wendell Slate had spent the last 3 years of that dog's life teaching him exactly that. Hand signals and boot heels and hand signals. Deuce's head came up off the concrete. He got his front end under him, then his back, the slow arthritic push of an 11-year-old dog, and he took 4 steps and stopped, and he was standing between the handler and Emory, square in the doorway, shoulder height to the man's belt. He didn't growl. He didn't lunge. He didn't show a tooth. He barked once. One bark, deep enough that the shop light rattled on its clip, and something metal moved in the unit behind them. The handler stopped walking. He looked at the dog, and he looked at the catch pole in his hand, and he did the arithmetic that men who handle animals for a living do very fast. And he turned around and put the pole back in the bed of the truck, and he got in, and he backed down the row, and he drove off Meeting Street without Trip Slate in the vehicle. Trip stood in the empty parking row holding a piece of paper. Emory said, "There's an Uber lot on Columbus. Charleston County Probate Court. Thursday, 9 a.m. Courtroom B. 11 people in the gallery. Camille in pearl gray, 3rd row, alone except for her son." The petition to set aside the 2019 instrument was called at 9:04. The drafting attorney took the stand first, a woman named Harriet Doss, 71, retired 4 years, who had driven up from Beaufort that morning. She identified the instrument. She identified her own signature. She identified Wendell Slate's and the 2 witnesses and the notary seal, and she testified that on the 12th of March, 2019, Wendell Slate sat at her office for 3 hours and was, in her words, the most clear-headed client she had that year. The judge asked her to read paragraph 1 of Article 4 aloud. She read it. "The corpus of the trust, $6.8 million and all titled chattels, to the person who has care, custody, and control of the dog Deuce on the date of my death and thereafter." Somebody in the gallery said, "What out loud?" Then Emory's counsel stood up and said he had one exhibit. One page. Not 91. 1. Transfer of ownership of the animal known as Deuce. Executed the afternoon of the funeral in a house on King Street. Signed by Camille Slate in her own hand. Witnessed by 2 members of the Ashley Hall Garden Society, both present in the courtroom under subpoena, and notarized by a notary public whose $200 fee had been paid, by check, by Camille Slate. The judge held that page up for a long moment. "Mrs. Slate," she said, "did you sign this?" Camille stood. She said, "I did." "Voluntarily?" "I did. Do you understand what you conveyed?" And Camille Slate said the only honest sentence she had said in 9 days. She said it was a dog. Court recessed at 9:31. At the recess, Bertram Cleaves walked to the bench and moved to withdraw as counsel of record, and the motion was granted, and he picked up his briefcase and walked out through the gallery past a woman he had known for 18 years without turning his head. Court resumed at 9:44. The petition to set aside was dismissed at 9:52. 40 minutes, gavel to gavel. $6.8 million. The King Street townhouse, 2 boats, and every titled chattel in the estate of Wendell Slate to the person who had care, custody, and control of the deaf dog, and the residuary split in 2 equal shares by name to Emory Slate and Ruth Vann. Emory drove back to Meeting Street that same afternoon and rolled the door up on Unit 14 and stood in front of the thing under the fitted canvas cover that he had not lifted in 9 days. He lifted it. Under it was a 1966 Shelby GT350, Wimbledon white, blue stripes, 41,000 original miles, sitting on 4 flat tires under a coat of dust that had been undisturbed since 2009. Wendell Slate bought that car at 26 years old, before the shipping line, before King Street, before Camille, before any of it, and he never told one living soul he still owned it. The title was in the glove box, in a manila envelope, and on the front of the envelope, in his father's blocky engineer's handwriting, 2 letters and 2 periods. Yes, the townhouse sold in November to satisfy the trust. Ruth Vann took the half she never asked for, put a new roof on the oyster house, gave every one of her 9 employees a raise, and was back behind the shucking table in McClellanville the following Tuesday at 6 in the morning, because that is what she has done for 19 years, and she was not about to stop over money. Camille and Tripp vacated King Street in 9 days. 9 days. The same 9 days it took a dog to walk 40 feet down a church aisle and change who owned everything. Here's the last thing. There's a dock behind the oyster house in McClellanville where the water goes flat around 5 in the afternoon. The Shelby sits up on the gravel by the fence now, running, insured, driven maybe twice a month. And in the shade of it, on the cool ground beside the front tire, there's a 137-pound brindle Bullmastiff, 11 years old, stone deaf, asleep in the shadow of a car worth more than the entire storage unit that hid it for 16 years. He doesn't know. He has never known. He never heard the funeral, or the dining room, or the courtroom, or the single bark he put through a parking row on Meeting Street. Some people read the accounts. Some people read the pages. And the one who couldn't hear a word of any of it, who had no idea there was money, or a will, or a hearing, or a stepmother, walked into a chapel on Broad Street and knew, out of 200 people, exactly whose feet to lie down across. She had 91 pages, and she read 4. She kept everything and gave away the dog. So let me ask you, and I want a straight answer, because there's only 2. If somebody handed you a deaf old dog and a bill for $1,847, would you have kept him? Yes or no? Tell me below.